Thank you, Kamal. Feel free. So, I will start with Kamal. There's a very popular saying in the civic space in the Gambia whenever we are calling for accountability and transparency on the issue of climate finance. We say, follow the money. So let's start with the money. Kamal, Africa receives only 23% of our climate finance, especially for what it needs to implement its own commitment. You work directly on the G20 agenda for South Africa. What structural changes in the global finance architecture would most shift that number?
Thank you so much, Fatu, and thank you everyone for being here. I know it's a very busy program, and so we're very honored that you've chosen to come to our session. So thank you for being here. Um, I think when we think about the international financial architecture, for most of us, we kind of just switch off. That's for the financiers and it's for the economists, and it's not for the rest of us. But in fact, the financing of the transition is probably one of the biggest barriers for African countries. And when we think about the international financial architecture, we need to think about three main things that we can all relate to, right? The one is money, the other one is tax, and the third one is debt, right? So when we think about money, one of the big barriers has to do with international liquidity, right? Or international assets held by the IMF, right? And one of the big problems that we're facing with this international money or liquidity in the IMF is that it's based on a quota system. And the quota system has a complicated formula, but the point of the quota system is that despite developing countries needing the quotas the most, needing the climate finance the most, Africa, for example, only gets 5.6% of the total quotas that are offered by the IMF in times of crisis. And so we have a situation where there's 992 billion US dollars worth of special drawing rights or IMF money that's sitting idle. Okay, and in the last crisis that we faced, for example, in the COVID-19 crisis, these quotas or this money was distributed highly in a really unequal way, and what happened was the countries that got most of the quotas were the ones that didn't need them, right? The Germanys of the world, the France of the world, the OECD countries. And one of the things that happened was those countries committed or promised to rechannel that money from the IMF into developing countries. And the promise was a promise of 100 billion US dollars. And of that 100 billion US dollars, only $2.5 billion was actually rechanneled. So I think this is another example of a failed or false promise of climate finance. And one of the things that needs to happen is a restructuring of that quota system in the IMF, right? So that's the first thing on money. Then when it comes to a debt, one of the key things that needs to happen with regards to debt is good debt, right? I think that often we treat debt as something that's bad, but in many instances when it's not exploitative or usurious, or when it's not illegitimate, debt is a conversation that you have with the future, right? It's a promise to pay in the future of actions that we're taking now. And given the urgency of the climate crisis, a huge amount of climate finance is going to have to happen through taking on sovereign debt. But the nature of the sovereign debt is incredibly important, right? So the interest rate on the debt, for example, needs to be lower than the rate of growth of these economies if it's going to be sustainable. It needs to come without conditionalities that constrain the ability to invest in public infrastructure, to invest in social spending, to invest in sustainable infrastructure and in people. And lastly, one of the key things that the G20 can do that it has clearly failed at doing is offering fresh capital or fresh investments in multilateral development banks. So that's the issue on debt.
Okay.
Finally, on taxation, right? I think that this is an area in which the African continent is really robbed blind, to put it bluntly. Capital flight and international and illicit financial flows. Illicit financial flows are things like trade misinvoicing, tax evasion, and corruption. These things that channel a legitimate tax income from the African continent is going out, right? And it's being lost. And this comes up to about 88 billion US dollars worth of money. So, if you put that together, there are adequate resources. Africa is a resource-rich continent, but the rules of the international financial architecture are robbing it of its rightful resources.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Kamal. You really mentioned very critical issues that Africa is a continent with rich resources, and we really need to do away with some of the architectures and structures in terms of international climate financing. And you mentioned really crucial issues, especially doing away with the quota system and also the issue of the interest rate on finance to be reduced. So I will come back to you because obviously finance is definitely something crucial. So I will move on to our next speaker and to just ask on the issue of who is being left out of the flows. We talked about finance. So who is really being left out of the flow? Africa's blue economy is valued at up to $450 billion dollars annually, according to the African business. And yet, we have coastal communities often the last to see those benefits. So what does a truly just and African-led blue economy actually look like to you?
Thank you, Fatou. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and to present the voice of Africa. I think before answering the question about economics, it's important maybe to remind the importance of the ocean. Every second breath that we take comes from the ocean, thanks to the phytoplankton that are really creating the oxygen. The famous oceanographer Sylvia Earles even said that no blue, no life, no blue, no green. If we look also at the African continent and why Africa is so important, you've mentioned, Fatou, in the opening that today the emissions are only representing 4%, but in 2050, in 25 years, the African population will represent 25% of the global population. So if we don't make sure that this economic growth is made in a sustainable manner, Africa itself can really just disrupt all the effort that we are really trying to do to maintain below the 1.5 degrees. So the third thing, it's about the $450 billion, which is a big number. I think it's very important to mention that these figures, in fact, are extraction. It represents fishes that are taken out of Africa to other countries. It's also represent oil drilling. It's representing all the vessels that are going across. So for me, when we mention about a more just blue economy, it should be an economy that is not extractive, but that is an economy where we redefine the value. Where we're bringing the value is that money really benefiting the communities. And also, instead of using expression to say that we should have them as beneficiaries, it's maybe to have them as co-designer to also be part of the solution.
Indeed. Thank you so much, Nasima. As you've mentioned, we need to ensure that we are not seeing the communities as just beneficiaries, but co-designers of these solutions. And you mentioned something very critical that, every single breath we take comes from the ozone, and that there is no blue life without the ozone, and no blue and no green. And we need to ensure that there is economic growth and also systematic change, especially on the issue of our blue economy. Dr. Michelle, I mentioned in my intro how women constitute 62% of the agricultural workforce, and yet women are the most impacted when it comes to food insecurity. I just wanted to ask, what is the most urgent systematic fix in terms of the challenges women in the agricultural sector actually face?
Thank you so much, Fatou, and thanks for having us. Good afternoon, Africa. We are very happy to be here today. I don't want to talk about a systemic fix. I want to talk about systemic shifts because we want to think positive. We want to think engagement, and we want to think moving from the challenges to the possibilities. The data you've cited is very critical because when we think about food security in Africa, it's not just a problem of agricultural production or productivity. It is most importantly a question of justice and equity. And I'm saying this because, as you've said, we have women and, of course, young people at the center of our agri-food system. But when it comes to opportunity to access, we don't see them. But they are at the core of these processes. So the results we are seeing are not accidental. These are definitely the results of unequal systems. So what do we want to see? For me, it's really how we are treating these structural inequalities in a way that we place equality and intergenerational, I want to insist on intergenerational justice at the core of this agri-food systems transformation. And I'm seeing two things here. The first thing is really the possibility from Africa to move from commitment. We make a lot of commitment to actual implementation, and that this implementation be accountable, that we create these mechanisms that help us see the change that we want to see. The second thing, it's definitely about how we want to invest in delivery systems that will unlock the potential of young people, young women in the continent. And as we do that, we also think about all these frameworks, all these agricultural policies across the countries, at the regional but also international level, that are not always taking into account not just the inclusion or the representation, because I think we know the numbers. We want to see the action. So we want our global leaders to come closer to our people, our young people, and really see what is happening on the ground. And we are seeing a lot of things happening.
Yeah.
We are seeing women leading climate smart projects across the continent. We are seeing how communities are driving value chains, turning local crops into profitable produce. We are also seeing our young people at the heart of digital platform, connecting farmers to the market and to finance. So if we have our global leaders at the heart of this and really creating these ecosystems that will make agriculture viable and profitable, I think we would have done a big move.
Yes, definitely, Doctor. Doctor said, hello, Africa, but I did not hear a response. So, hello, Africa. Okay, that's not clear. Hello, Africa. Thank you. She said we need systematic shifts and thinking positive. And we need to move away from challenges to possibilities. And agriculture or food systems is just not about agricultural productivity, but about justice and about equity. And we need to center intergenerational equity and intergenerational leadership, because our young people and our women contribute or consist the most in our agri-food systems. So that will bring me back to the issue of the money. Come on. You know, we always, when we talk about solutions, we always, you know, it always revolves around the money. So I'll come back to you, and just wanted to ask, because 90% of Africa's climate finance comes from international sources. You briefly touched on that in your response, especially on some of the solutions that we need, with only 10% generated domestically. Is that dependence a vulnerability, and what can we do to actually change this?
So it's important to think about where vulnerability comes from, right? Where does financial vulnerability come from? And when you're investing, you're looking at returns on an investment, but you're also looking at the amount of risk there is in a firm, in a country, in a region, right? And one of the things that causes high risk on sovereign debt for African countries is the fact that a lot of the fundamental elements of a sustainable economy are often imported, right? So, for example, despite having huge amounts of agricultural potential, many countries are net importers of basic food goods, right? And when there is a war created by no one in Africa but by someone in in Eastern Europe or by a country in the Middle East, that leads to a huge spike in oil prices, in food prices, which puts a huge strain on the ability of a country to import, right? So what we see is a huge amount of vulnerability to external conditions, to geopolitical events that are not caused by the continent, right? And one of the ways that you create a resilience in the financial system, or resilience, is by creating resilience in the structure of the economy, which means having food sovereignty, right? Having food sovereignty in agroecology, having energy sovereignty through renewable and sustainable energies, and having the ability to exercise industrial policy and industrialize one's economy. So those are the three main elements that make an economy sustainable and make, therefore, it less risk averse and more attractive to investment. So if we're not thinking about those kind of sovereignties, right, then we're cutting ourselves short.
Definitely. We need food sovereignty and we need energy sovereignty. And we need to also ensure that, because at the end of the day, we are always vulnerable to geopolitical situations and geopolitical tensions. But when we have food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, it makes our situation a bit easier in terms of adapting and building our resilience. Thank you so much, Kamal. And then I will move on to Nassima again. Every single year, Africa loses $1.3 billion to illegal fishing, especially in West Africa, according to the World Economic Forum. Meanwhile, the continent's fishing industry employs over 12 million people. How do we protect those livelihoods while building a blue economy that does not reduce extractive models?
Thank you, Fatou. $1.3 billion of illegal fisheries. But the most uncomfortable truth is that most of the extraction, in fact, are legal. There are bilateral treaties.
Yes.
And it's happening. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. How do we implement that? So obviously it's a stronger governance that needs to be in place. We have tools that exist. We have satellites, we have drones, so we can capture this, but we also need to be accountable to make sure. There is also, I was privileged to come because I'm part of those Women for Change, and another Women for Change is leading an effort called the High Seas Treaty, and I think each African country needs to sign this High Seas Treaty, which is really about protecting the biodiversity of our ocean. Secondly, about creating value, and Kamal touched a word on that. Everything that we do, and not only fisheries, blue economy, it's not only fisheries, it's also seaweed that are exported by big commodities companies to make pharmaceutical products. But all the value is created outside of Africa. So why don't we have processing companies? Why don't we have cold chain and also market access to these farmers?
Yep, definitely. Definitely, Nassima. I mean, you touch on something that is very, very critical. You mentioned that, in fact, some of these illegal fishing are actually legal through treaties. And as someone that actually came from a coastal community, we see firsthand how these fisheries activities, in fact, from legal treaties are actually causing so much damage to communities because there is overfishing and there is extractive activities happening, especially pollution, and it's really affecting our marine environment. So the fact that you actually touch on that is something that is really crucial and something that we really need to look at and how these treaties that we are signing have an impact on our blue economy. And then that will bring me to my final question to Dr. Michelle. Through the One Planet Fellowship, Award has built a network of over 400 African researchers that are actually working on climate resilient agriculture. What are they telling us that the global decision makers are yet to tell us?
I think they already know. I'm just going to repeat here 3 important things. The first thing is thinking about Africa not as a whole, but as a sum of many parts. Yeah? Because sometimes we see similarities, sometimes we also see differences, but how do we work across these similarities and differences? And this brings me to the importance of context. What we are seeing today is a lot of investment around the traditional model of technology transfer. Yet when we see our work with the scientists, there is a lot already happening in the continent and a lot that already applies to our local realities. And our scientists are working on this solution, but we rarely see our governments, our leaders supporting this initiative. So how can we continue to push this so that we can actually see the results? Because these solutions are delivering results. The only problem is that sometimes they are not well documented. So there is a problem there that our leaders need to also think about how we need to anticipate that. The second thing is about the intra-collaboration in Africa. We are seeing similar issues in different parts, but scientists will not always know each other. Yeah? So we are pushing them to continue working across the borders, across the sectors, sharing their knowledge in different networks. And thirdly, and I'm looking at Kamal, investment. Not the one-off investment, but the long-term investment that will help us see the real change on the ground.
Definitely, long-term investments that will see or that will help us to see real changes on the ground. And we need to stop seeing Africa as a whole, but at least as a sum of many parts. And we obviously need to support locally led climate solutions and build inter-collaboration between different researchers so that there's more visibility and more recognition that we are doing, especially with the innovations that we're bringing. And please join me in thanking our speakers for this panel discussion because our 3 experts have really mentioned really crucial things, that the answers actually exist and the innovations exist, the research exists, and what we need is actually resources and the structures to ensure that we are catching up and building our resilience as a continent. So please thank our speakers for the panel, for sharing really incredible things that they're actually doing. Thank you so much to our speakers.